I'm Slava Zilber. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today, I'm talking to Fischer, an independent videographer, editor, and computer scientist web designer, co-founder and designer of the website News2Share.com. Ford, please explain what has happened to your Facebook account. Have you had similar experiences before?
Right. So my outlet is called News2Share, and basically what I do is I live stream situations mostly related to activism and sort of domestic unrest in the United States. And so on that on that platform, I do live streams, and then after the end of a situation, I post sort of HD video summarizing that situation. But people can still go back and reference the live stream to see the context of every shot. And that's sort of my way of kind of differentiating myself from the mainstream media and creating kind of an alternative. In terms of what happened this weekend, I was covering a day of activism taking place in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where the Kentucky Derby, to those who don't know, this is a big annual horse race event that goes on, not a particularly political event. But that was going on Saturday. And a number of activist groups were using that situation as sort of a platform or a setting for their activism. It's also the city that Breonna Taylor was killed, who is a woman who was killed when police basically raided the wrong house in a no-knock raid, and her boyfriend confronted the police officers. Ultimately, charges were dropped against him because it seems that the raid was erroneous. But she died, and so far, police haven't been charged. In any event, that city has become sort of a centerpiece of activism related to that subject. And so on Saturday, I was live streaming as right-wing militia groups entered the city and were confronted by anti-fascists and anti-racists who were, both sides being armed. And then later in the afternoon, an all-black militia called the NFAC, the Not Effing Around Coalition, was also marching, and they marched to Churchill Downs, which is the site of the Kentucky Derby itself. At some point in the afternoon, my Facebook was completely eliminated, and there was no notification of any sort. What happened was that once I was finished live streaming, I use a third-party app called Boxcast that allows me to live stream to both Twitter and Facebook simultaneously. And so the live stream continued to work properly on Twitter, and theoretically it should have been working on Facebook. But when I finished my broadcast, somebody had messaged me on Twitter saying, "What happened to your Facebook?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know." So I opened the Facebook app and it said, "Your account has been disabled." Basically, without any kind of notification, it seems that my entire Facebook was taken down permanently. So obviously this was sort of devastating, and I posted a screenshot of that and then some details to Twitter and sort of made a viral Twitter thread explaining what had happened. I think some important context for this is that in the last few weeks, Facebook has been especially sensitive about militia groups, armed activists organizing on their website, and they have made strides to remove people who participate in militias and militia organizations themselves from the platform altogether. So although it was never confirmed to me because there was no notification of any kind, I suspect that they took down my page because I was basically talking about the subject of people with guns doing activism. I was talking about militias. I was live streaming them, filming them, photographing them that day. And to an untrained computer, to an algorithm that makes decisions about removing people's content, it seems like either a computer or some human being who didn't put in any effort to really understand what I was, deleted my entire account. My last Facebook post before that happened was actually I was still on field, but I had taken a photograph of a moment in which someone pointed a handgun at another person. It was sort of, it happened inadvertently. A person was holding a handgun kind of irresponsibly. They unholstered it. And then while in the process of taking it from pointing down to pointing up, they had it pointed straight at another person. And so I took a picture of that picture, right? From my iPhone, I took a picture of the DSLR where I had the photo and then posted it online saying, so far there hasn't been much violence today, but this is how people die. People were handling firearms really irresponsibly. it was clearly a condemnation of gun violence, of gun irresponsibility. It wasn't me endorsing anything about that sort of action. But given that that was my last post before it was taken down, I assume that Facebook looks at that post, sees a picture of someone pointing a gun at another person, and then it doesn't differentiate between endorsing it and covering it in my capacity as a journalist. To answer your other question about has this happened before, I did have one situation in which a website called Reclaim the Net had written about how I was demonetized on YouTube a year ago. And when I posted an article written by them about me being censored on YouTube to Facebook, I actually was banned for 2.5 days from posting on Facebook. And it happened instantaneously. It wasn't like someone reported it somehow. It was literally, I posted the link and then it immediately said, you've been banned for posting for 2.5 days, or I think it was 60 hours. So it has happened once before that Facebook sort of suspended me from posting, but never to the extent that we have there, which is an outright deletion without any kind of notification. Twitter has never particularly done anything censorious to me that I'm aware of, but I was sort of, a controversial situation happened with me a year ago, which was that in June of 2019, YouTube broadened its sort of definitions of what it considered unsafe content, and they demonetized my entire YouTube channel. And so from June until January, I was totally demonetized, and I at least once a week basically complained about it in some form or another on Twitter toward Team YouTube. And ultimately, they admitted that was a mistake and also fixed it. So with respect to yesterday, my Facebook was restored basically inexplicably in the afternoon. So it was down for about 24 hours, but it theoretically was expected to be down forever. And again, there was actually no notification. It just came back as if it was never gone. And so I think that's really alarming, because I think that people who have their content taken down or are outright deleted by these platforms, at the absolute bare minimum, they should be entitled to an explanation. We're taking you down because, we believe that you're involved in unsafe activities. We believe that you're committing crimes. We believe that you're committing hate speech. Whatever it is, if there's going to be a policy and its enforcement includes, suppressing, deleting, removing, censoring, whatever, I think people should be entitled to a human being informing them. And I think that if that burden was even there, I doubt it would have happened to me, because somebody who would have had to actually write an explanation would have had to say, we saw that in your journal, as a journalist, you took a photo of gun violence and then we wanted to take that down. Oh, wait, actually, that doesn't make sense. So I guess that would be my demand, but I think that it would probably cut into the bottom line. They'd probably have to hire more people and less robots.
And how should these people operate if you had the power to design this system for Facebook, for Twitter? What guidelines would you institute?
Right. So sort of like I was alluding to, I think that there are probably people smarter than me who could describe what the rules should be, what you're allowed to post or do on Facebook. I think that there are people can argue in good faith multiple different positions on, for example, whether people should have sort of the right to organize meetups on Facebook that are going to involve, certain political ideologies or, the presence of firearms. I can empathize with why Facebook feels uncomfortable with that. With that being said, I think that one thing that should be imperative, and I can't really imagine any reason other than a profit margin that anybody would disagree with this, is I think that people should be entitled to know the specifics of what they are being, put down for, right? If someone is getting suspended from being able to post, if somebody's individual post is being taken down, if somebody's account is being terminated, I think people should be entitled to an explanation. It shouldn't just sort of happen as if the person never existed. They just vanish and they're told nothing about why. I think another really standard baseline is that in the event that somebody loses an account or something, people should probably be entitled to their data, right? One concern that I had yesterday and the day before, as my content was down, and I didn't know would I ever get my Facebook back, is, I had been posting on the same Facebook account since high school, right? I'm 26 now, but my graduation photos, family photos, photos with grandparents, some of which are not alive anymore, that sort of thing, are on Facebook. And I think that if somebody is going to be removed from it, they should be, it's their data and they should be entitled to get it back. And so that was something I was really worried about, is sort of never being able to get those sorts of priceless kind of like memories back. So, I mean, those would be some bare minimum requirements that I wish that they could follow. And again, I think the only reason that they don't have human reviewers or human beings typing out explanations of takedowns is because it would take time. It would take more labor. But if you can have a robot censor people, it's going to cost a heck of a lot less, because a robot can decide in a microsecond, that you said the wrong thing.
You addressed your assumptions why they have removed your account. Do you think it was in a way political? I spoke to Ricardo Vaz of the independent website Venezuelanalysis over a week ago, and their account was removed from Twitter and then reinstated very recently. And they are critical of the opposition and less critical sometimes of Nicolas Maduro. And he believed that it is at least partly political.
Right. I think that to say that it's political is probably true, but I think that there's a trap that a lot of people fall into when discussing this issue. And that trap is that I think people tend to assume that there's a political, straightforward left-right bias. And so I will often see that people on the right, especially in the MAGA movement, and Donald Trump Jr. speaks about this a lot, is the idea that Trump supporters or just right-wingers are being censored. However, Facebook also takes down pages belonging to communists, to anti-fascists. In 2018, there was an enormous purge that primarily targeted anti-war, websites critical of American foreign policy, as well as critical of the drug war. Websites and pages that were talking about legalizing cannabis, legalizing psychedelic mushrooms, and so forth. And so those topics, while not explicitly leftist, would probably be more aligned with the left. I guess my point is that in my experience, from what I've seen go down on Facebook and generally on social media, it's sort of my position that it seems like, although takedowns can be political, it's not so much about left versus right. It's more about like what is sort of within the Overton window, what's like acceptable or like normal. And so, while a Democrat may likely not have mainstream Democratic positions censored by Facebook, somebody expressing sympathies to Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, it would not surprise me that that person would be removed or censored on social media. The same way as I think that we generally know that, on the right, someone is probably not being censored for advocating, lower taxes, but somebody with extreme right-wing views on immigration, for example, may well find themselves banned from social media. So again, I don't want to imply any kind of equivalence between the far left and the far right. But in terms of social media, it seems to me that it's pretty indiscriminatory in terms of the manner in which Facebook is taking down anybody kind of talking about things outside of the mainstream. This affects someone like me quite directly because I don't consider my work to be left or right at all, but I document, activism, which as a tactic tends to be people who are on the more extreme side, especially those who would come out armed, right? So I spend a lot of time filming armed anarchists, armed communists, armed socialists, armed far-right individuals, right? all of these different types of groups that very much fall outside of the mainstream. And that seems to be what Facebook is, bothered by. So on Saturday, at the exact moment that I was taken down, I was live streaming the NFAC, which is basically a Black nationalist militia. And earlier in the day, I had filmed confrontations between a far-right militia and, presumably far-left people on the other side, anti-fascists, anti-racists, who would probably identify as socialists or communists, but again, were also armed. So I don't know which individual one of those things, or if any single one of those things was the actual reason that I went down, because I was notified and because I wasn't notified, and I'll never know. But a hodgepodge of various extremes carrying guns, and something among that seems to have been the reason.
You have addressed these protests in the United States. Have you, over the last several years, particularly now, documented hostility and violence towards journalists, either from the protesters or from the authorities?
So I think this is an interesting question, and this is a problem that's been happening in the United States, generally speaking. So I guess I'll first start with activists. What's interesting is that there is broadly speaking, there are some people who have hostilities towards media on both the left and the right. Donald Trump has certainly inflamed anti-press rhetoric and brought it a little bit more into the mainstream. So it's sort of common to have people, for example, yelling like fake news, fake news. So, just as an example, a few weeks ago, I was filming a confrontation between people who were supporting a Confederate monument and people who wanted it taken down in the state of Georgia. And I was taking photographs of there was a person who had a shirt on the right-wing side. It said something like, "I'm a straight, white, Republican male. Is there anything else I can do to offend you?" Right. So it was a very provocative t-shirt. And I went to take a photograph of it. And the guy actually went to like smack the camera basically. And I was like, whoa, 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 right. Right. And then he then tried to do the same thing to a female journalist. So I haven't faced enormous violence directed at me specifically, but those sorts of moments, that kind of hostility, the automatic assumption that I must be sort of against them or something, I think that that's sort of been inflamed in the last few years. There also, to some extent, can be people on the left who are hostile or worried about people filming them, especially as it relates to like their faces. So I sometimes say that I actually feel more comfortable at events when people are masked, because when people are wearing masks, they're not as concerned that, they could be filmed and have their face seen and get them, in trouble or something. So, there is, to some extent, there are people on activist sides who can be bothered by media. But I think it's important to note that, like, activists tend to want their message heard. So I find myself actually mostly, not antagonized upon by most activists, because if you're willing to go out in the street to yell about or fight about some particular subject, you probably want to spread that message. And the cameras are really the way to do that. So I tend to find that it is pretty rare for activists of any flavor to explicitly want to attack the media. Police, on the other hand, are a little bit different. So at the beginning of the sort of unrest that's happened this summer, so following the death of George Floyd, I was filming protests here in Washington, D.C. And on the second night of those protests, I was shot twice with pepper rounds. They basically come out sort of like almost like a paintball gun, except they explode and have a sort of chemical impact once they hit you. So it left, a welt on my shoulder, but then, it also sort of blinded me for about 5 minutes. That happened twice on the second night. And on the third night, I was actually shot square in the forehead with a rubber bullet by the police. That left a half golf ball size sore out of my head. And I actually didn't, I ended up skipping the following night. Was a really big and kind of historical night for activism in Washington, D.C., and I didn't go out to it because I thought that I might have had a concussion. And to this day, I don't know whether I did or not. But the question is, are the police targeting you specifically because you're press, or are they just sort of spray and pray is the joking way that I would describe just, firing munitions into a crowd without placing your target. To a certain extent, it almost doesn't matter. It's my opinion that anybody handling any kind of a firearm or a weapon really should be aware of where they're placing their shot. And that includes non-lethal munitions, right? So I don't think it's acceptable for a police officer to shoot at a journalist, because on the one hand, if they know they're a journalist, then they're targeting you for exercising your First Amendment right to film them. And on the other hand, if they're accidentally shooting you, then they're firing without knowing where their shot's going to be placed. They're just indiscriminately firing without knowing their target. And in my mind, that's unacceptable as well. So, I think that there tends to be more of a police crackdown on media, especially in situations where the police themselves are acting in a way that they might find inconvenient to have filmed. But it can be very hard to find accountability for that sort of thing. I will absolutely never know the name or identity of the police officers who shot those things at me. So, there's nothing I'll essentially be able to do about it other than just continue to report and talk about that sort of thing when it happens.
I have interviewed the journalist Wyatt Reed about the protests in Portland. And he talked to me about how he was injured by the police. And from what I have seen, something similar happened to him when he was covering the protests in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
You have spoken about the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, where Hezekiah was murdered.
Yes.
And you have spoken about the conduct of the police, how they did not separate the opposing protesters.
Mm-hmm.
I asked professor and author of The End of Policing, Alex Vitale, about the conduct of the police with right-wing and left-wing protesters.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe it was just a failure to act properly? Do you believe police are just trying to do their best, or do you see, like Professor Vitale, a different approach with right-wing protesters and with left-wing protesters, whom they consider generally more of a threat, in his view?
Right. So speaking specifically on Charlottesville, I mean, I think there were a ton of failures that day, which I've of course I filmed, and I was an associate producer of the PBS film Charlottesville, which won an Emmy, and I would encourage people to watch that if you can. For a much more detailed explanation of this. But to put it very simply, there were a ton of police failures on the day of Unite the Right, which was August 12, 2017. Among them, the police didn't position themselves between the two sides. The Charlottesville police were theoretically leading in command that day. However, there were way more state police present, and the two agencies didn't have their radios synchronized. So even though state police and local police were physically next to each other, they actually weren't communicating with one another, which meant that they basically with lack of communication of any sort, they couldn't really coordinate responses. And also, so they didn't step in the middle of the violence at all. And then when they did ultimately intervene, they pushed the two sides together, which exacerbated the violence. They said, oh, we're pushing everybody away. They pushed the right-wing side toward the left-wing side. So that didn't quell the violence at all. And of course, as we know, Heather Hare died, and then two helicopter pilots died as well. So that was a unique situation. I've seen some other situations like it where the police let two sides fight and then once the violence escalates to a certain point, they step in. I witnessed that in Georgia, a month ago, of course, without fatality, but it very well could have been a lot of people fighting and other people there with guns. So these situations can certainly be dangerous. But more broadly speaking, I think that the asymmetry between the way that the police treat the left and the right is attributable to a couple of factors. So some people will basically just claim, well, the police tend to prefer the right. That might be true to some extent, right? I have filmed, for example, in Washington, D.C., in a fight between Proud Boys, which is sort of a right-wing, some would say a gang. They would call themselves a social club. But in a fight between them and the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was setting an American flag on fire, following a fight, multiple people arrested, 2 police officers supposedly injured. As I filmed the Proud Boys walk away, one of the Proud Boys actually got like a fist bump with the police. Like the police were basically like, offering their sort of support. So in a moment like that, it was pretty clear who the police liked. With that being said, I think in general, there's a difference in tactic between the left and the right, which is that, and again, I'm talking about more on the extreme side. So a lot of the Democrat, nonprofit, et cetera, left will always coordinate with police and apply for permits and so forth. But when it comes to the further left, anti-fascists, most socialists, et cetera, those people don't believe in working with the police. Like it's a core sort of value to not apply for permits, to not get sort of permission, basically just to act and to not act in cohort with the police. And so I've seen situations where, for example, people will gather on the left, police will go up to them and actually try to say, can we work together? Can you tell me your route so that we can cut off traffic and make sure that you don't intersect with any traffic, that kind of thing. And it's pretty common for leftists to say, no, we will not collaborate with you. We don't talk to cops. On the right-wing side, you have a lot more usually support for the police to the point of almost imitating the police. Like literally, you'll have people who physically are dressing up like police officers and soldiers, kind of emulating them. And I guess they say imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. I think that it sort of makes sense that the side that considers itself to be supportive of the police, applying for permits, talking to the cops, and basically following their instructions, that the police end up sort of seeming more supportive of them. So, it's complex and it varies situation to situation, and it also varies in cause. But I would say that it's generally true in my experience that, when the police end up separating two sides, I often see, the police's back turned towards the right-wing side, and facing left-wing side. So it seems like the police tend to think of the left more like an enemy or a threat, and the right more like friendly, or there's an underlying assumption that they're not going to be the ones acting violently, which is not necessarily linked to the truth of the matter.
You said that the police officers were supposedly injured. Have you, over your work, documented people lying, deceiving, and how has that played out for you, and what were the consequences?
Well, I tend to find that there usually isn't a ton of narrative explanation of situations from police. They tend to be very tight-lipped on scene. It's usually very difficult for me to interview police officers. It's happened a few times, but usually they won't say anything, and often I don't even try. And similarly, after situations, usually police statements are extremely vague. So in the case of the situation I was talking about, leftists set a couple of American flags on fire. And, there was basically a very generic statement that said that 2 police officers went to the hospital with minor burn injuries. The reason I guess I said supposedly is, when I reviewed my footage, I saw one police officer seemed to turn around perhaps in pain or trying to get away from the fire. It looked like maybe one was. It was hard for me to find it. I don't necessarily dispute that it happened. But I just can't know. And they don't tend to release a ton of information. For example, I don't think I'd ever be able to find get or access a photograph of what happened. And it's also sometimes extraordinarily hard to actually get access to body camera footage. We had a situation last week where police shot somebody in Washington, D.C., and they actually released the body camera footage about 12 hours later, presumably because they believed that the body camera footage would show that the shooting was justified. Of course, if you actually watch it, this was the shooting of Dion K, if people want to look into it. If you actually watch that footage, many people who were protesting the night of that shooting would still say, we still don't think that shooting was justified. The police, and from their point of view, they thought that the body camera footage would help them. But they released it in 12 hours when they thought it would help their narrative. That's how easy it is for them to put it out. But in spite of that, the police tend not to release body camera footage of situations so quickly. I think that it would be really helpful to me as a journalist, but really just to the public as taxpayers, if the body camera footage of the police could be more accessible. I mean, that's something that I'd really like to see changed. But frankly, I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to happen. Even the Democrats' police reform bill, which supposedly should be moving us in a more liberal direction as it relates to body cameras, even their bill, if passed, it says that the people who are actually entitled to body camera footage are defendants in cases, people who believe that the body camera footage will affect their own criminal case, the lawyers of the people in such cases, the supervisor of the police officer, basically even the reforms suggested by the people perceived as like the most advocating of transparency in government, even their reform wouldn't actually give the public the right to see body camera footage of situations like that. Personally, I guess I would say that that's unfortunate, but I think that would probably go a long way toward transparency and, like you sort of asked about, being able to trust the efficacy of statements by police.
I would like to address your working method. Do you release everything? And how do you edit it? Is it possible to just not edit material?
Right. So the way that I basically operate is that to the extent possible, right, there are some times when this is extraordinarily difficult, but I try to live stream situations beginning to end. So what I do is I have a HD sort of studio cinema quality camera, and I mount my iPhone on top of that. And so I live stream to Facebook, Twitter, and sometimes YouTube while I'm covering something. And so on the HD camera, I can't record every single second, right? Battery and data, make it so it's not possible to record in HD every single moment of something. But at least, when my technology all works, when everything works the way it's supposed to, my live stream is filming every single moment. So you can see every single thing that I see on a given occasion. So after an event happens, that live stream is preserved. People can see the entire situation beginning to end. And then I edit down from my HD footage that I collected on my camera, usually a highlight reel, usually about 10 minutes long. And on Twitter, I format it as a thread where it's usually 1 or 2 minute clips, and then maybe like 6 to 10 of those. So people see a sort of a narrative summary. And to be clear, I don't mean that I'm narrating it, right? The footage is basically raw. You pretty much never see me in it. But you basically end up with a summary of the situation in raw footage form that is edited down into highlights, but you can go back and watch the live stream and you'll see the context of every single shot. And so in my opinion, this removes the concern that somebody might have of, what if you take words out of context, or what if you're cutting it down only into the parts that sort of make one side look violent, whatever kind of accusation that people might have toward media, which I think is actually well-founded in the case of most mainstream media that might spend 2 hours at a situation and then their story is 90 seconds long, right? It's cut down in a way that's quite incomplete. For me, I try to make my 10-minute video summaries as complete as possible. But I additionally have the context of the live stream that basically acts as a backup, that people will know that they could see the entire context for every shot.
A year ago, you delivered the speech, "Your Right to Film the Police," and explained how it is connected to the First Amendment. On September 7th, the extradition proceedings against Julian Assange continued. Could you please address the significance and the connection between your work and the prosecution of Julian Assange, particularly for press freedom, First Amendment?
That's an interesting question. So yeah, to address the first thing that you mentioned, I gave a speech that was basically about your right to film the police. And I think what was interesting about that speech, and I would encourage people to watch it, is that was actually, I was invited to speak at a conservative conference. And what I told the organizer of that conference was, if I'm going to speak at this thing, I'm not going to give a speech about something that that your audience already believes in, right? I'm not going to go out there and give a speech about, oh, guns are awesome or something, right? So, I wanted to give a speech about something that I cared about a lot, but that also I thought that some people in the audience might not necessarily agree with. And so many people in that audience were, generally speaking, like pro-police. And just to give context, like a former president of the National Rifle Association spoke at that same conference. Like, this was a conservative group that generally would consider themselves supportive of the police. And so I was trying to tell them, it doesn't actually imply that you're against the police to record them. Police doing the right thing should want to be documented doing so. And police doing the wrong thing might not like being recorded, but it's an obvious societal social good to record those situations. And one just quick interesting moment from that, during a sort of Q&A, there was one audience member who said, yeah, but there's this problem, which is that people will film the police and you'll only see part of the situation, or you'll see it from a distance, and it might make the police officer look bad when they shouldn't. Simple example, what if someone hits a police officer and then someone starts recording and the police officer hits them back? It looks like the cop hit them unprovoked. And I explained, well, in my opinion, the problem there is that the footage is incomplete, not the fact that it was filmed, but the fact that it wasn't filmed enough. So the solution to that would be complete body camera footage, live streaming, trying to film a situation beginning to end. So all of the same types of solutions that I talk about really in all of the course of my journalism, not just related to the police. Circling it back to Julian Assange, as you mentioned, I don't have any extremely direct, I guess, connection to him. I've filmed protests supporting WikiLeaks. I've filmed and interviewed Chelsea Manning. But with that being said, I think that probably the comparison maybe to be made is that Julian Assange styles himself as a publisher and a journalist, and he's just putting out basically information as he receives it. What tends to be in question, I think, what the legal question surrounding him is, to what extent does he, conspire with the people who are, breaking their nation's laws in order to get him the information. But it's usually generally understood that journalists publishing information, even information that was originally acquired illegally, tend to have the right to publish it, right? So, I mean, this was the position of the Obama administration, where, Barack Obama wanted Chelsea, or the Barack Obama administration wanted Chelsea Manning killed, right? Chelsea Manning leaks information to WikiLeaks, and so Obama's, administration seeks the death penalty. And she ultimately was found not guilty on the one charge that could have carried that penalty, was sentenced to 35 years, if I recall correctly. And then ultimately Obama commuted the sentence right before the inauguration of Trump. However, for all of the harshness, I guess you could say, of the Obama administration going hard on whistleblowers, her as well as, seeking Edward Snowden, they still didn't actually try to prosecute Julian Assange, because although he was publishing the information that Chelsea Manning allegedly illegally acquired, their opinion was that, Assange is a journalist and it would have chilling effects to press freedom. So, in my case, it creates something challenging. For, I talk about the necessity, in my opinion, of body camera footage being available to the public. But, you know, if, for example, a whistleblower police officer were to release body camera footage that they, you know, had illegally acquired, you know, it was an unauthorized release, should I be scared that the journalist who actually publishes that footage after it's sent to them could be penalized themselves legally, as if they themselves did the hacking or the unauthorized access? You know, I think that that's really concerning.
I watched one of your recent videos, and I saw people with special gear, with guns, shouting.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned how you wore equipment. I can see on your profile photo, you are wearing a special helmet.
Right.
How do you deal with the situations, and what do you make of this common rhetoric that allegedly now America is moving in the direction of fascism, and there is this escalation under Trump in recent times?
Right. So, firstly, just with respect to the equipment that I wear, yeah. So I definitely vary my protective gear based on the particular type of situation I'm going to be at. So, for example, I tend to wear, I have a couple of bulletproof vests. One that's a Kevlar vest that basically covers your body fairly well, but it only it's probably only rated to stop pistol rounds. And then I have a level 3, which basically means it defeats threats up to and including rifles, right? So I've actually tested this type of vest before, put it on a dummy and shot it with an AK. And it will stop about 13 rounds from an AK-47 or an AR-15, that sort of thing. So if I'm going to be at a situation where I anticipate the presence of a lot of rifles, I tend to wear a vest like that, which is very heavy and very sweaty. If I'm going to be in a situation where I am not anticipating a huge number of rifles, but I think it's possible that there will be violence, I tend to wear a Kevlar vest. Similarly, I do have a ballistic helmet, as you saw in like my profile picture. I tend to wear that kind of thing, again, if it's going to be a situation where I think there's going to be a lot of guns and a possibility of violence. But usually I wear a ball cap that identifies myself as press, and I have that lined typically with what's called a bump cap. So it looks like a normal ball cap, but it has sort of a helmet effect if someone were to, throw a brick at my head. Similarly, if I'm going to be at a situation where I anticipate police violence, and this has been more relevant in the last few months, then I wear, goggles, which I can put over my eyes if things turn heavy, and same thing with the gas mask that I can just, lift up to my face if need be. And those things are relevant for things like pepper spray, pepper balls, tear gas, rubber bullets, and so forth. In fact, actually, the night that, as I mentioned, I was shot in the head with a rubber bullet, I actually had goggles on. If I didn't have goggles on, and if it had gone in my eye, I mean, I certainly would have lost my eye. And there's been a lot of press who have lost their eyes. For example, in Minneapolis a couple of months ago, that's happened to a few people. In my case, the rubber bullet actually just strafed, the goggles were kind of to here. It just strafed the top of the goggles. So in addition to the round hitting my head and causing the sore, it actually pushed the goggle down into my nose, and I ended up with a cut on my nose right here from that amount of force. But so to anybody who's thinking about covering these sorts of situations, a gas mask and strong goggles are absolute musts. With respect to your other question, I think you were basically alluding to or asking about, the country moving in the direction of fascism. It really depends on who you ask. I tend, in my capacity as press, not to make statements about, I don't want to call Donald Trump, good or bad. I don't want to call protesters good or bad, et cetera, right? I tend to actually leave any kind of personal thoughts that I have about those things out of it. But I will say that generally speaking, the country is moving in an escalating direction in terms of the violence that we're seeing on the streets. The violence is escalating. There are more and more guns present at these events. You know, and the police, or like the presence of federal agents at these events, is also increasing, right? The willingness to deploy the National Guard, you know, at things, the willingness of the immediacy of you know, having riot police at these situations, all of that has sort of increased, and it seems to be kind of going in an upward trajectory, right? The Trump fan will say that, you know, this represents the police, you know, somehow protecting freedom. You know, and of course the leftists will say that that escalation of force represents a slide into fascism. And I would say that, you know, it might be up to people who are smarter than me to make predictions about what direction the country is going. But I hope that that my raw footage can sort of provide the tools that people need to make that kind of analysis.
Thank you very much for this interview, Ford.
Of course. Thank you for having me.